In this conversation of El Café Latinx, among other things, I asked Hernan Galperin of the Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Southern California some practical advice for doctoral students. And one of the things he underscored was the importance of learning the craft of grant application writing very early in the process, because that's a major pathway towards career success. About this and many other interesting topics is this conversation in El Café Latinx. What's the experience of being a Latinx scholar in the field of communication and media studies? What are the main challenges and opportunities that come with our identities? These are the issues that we'll talk about in El Café Latinx, where some of the leading voices in the field will share their professional experiences. Hola, my name is Pablo Boczkowski. I teach at Northwestern University, where I hold the Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani Chair in Communication. Together with Mora Matassi, doctoral student at Northwestern and executive producer of this podcast, we invite you to discover the journeys of scholars who are at the cutting edge of creating knowledge about Latinx communication across the Americas. These are our stories. Esas son nuestras historias. Estas son nuestras historias. Welcome to this new episode of El Café Latinx. I am thrilled to have with me today Hernan Galperin. Hernan is an associate professor at the Annenberg School for Communication of the University of Southern California, where he also directs the Annenberg Network on International Communication. Hernan did his undergraduate studies at the University of Buenos Aires in Argentina, and then got his MA and his PhD at Stanford University in communication. And in 2000, he started as an assistant professor at the University of Southern California. He received tenure there, left to go to work at the Universidad de San Andrés in Argentina, where he had a very extensive career also building a very important institutional infrastructure there, the Center for the Study of Technology and Society, and then returned to the University of Southern California a few years ago. He is considered, and rightly so, one of the foremost experts in IT policy in Latin America, in issues of political economy, and so on and so forth. He is widely published both in book and in article formats. He's a member of the Information and Media Global Future Council and the World Economic Forum, and a non-resident fellow at CIDE in Mexico, has received a number of very large grants. And I am truly thrilled to have you with us today. So welcome to El Café Latinx, Hernan.
Thank you, Pablo. It's an honor to be here, despite that we can't have we can have coffee. It's just that we can't share coffee as it would be great. But really, thank you for the invitation and for this great series of podcasts.
Thank you for being with us today. So I'd like to start by asking you, how did it all begin? You know, how was the start of the journey that led you to become a professor?
My journey, I think I don't know if my journey is there were a lot of unexpected turns in this journey, I would say. But let me tell you how I ended up in this field, because my undergrad is in sociology. I had always an interest in sociology and economics. And media was not really on my radar until a little bit before graduation from Universidad de Buenos Aires. I got a gig, as now we call it. It wasn't a job, but it was really a gig to help with a survey that ADEPA was conducting. ADEPA is the trade association of the newspapers in Argentina. And this really tells a story of how media has changed, because at the time, ADEPA had sort of an idea, which is they print a lot of papers, and then they give out the papers to the kiosks to sell, and a lot of them are returned because they don't sell. What do we do with all these papers that we don't sell? At the time, the idea was, why don't we build a program with schools where we donate these papers to the schools, but we build a program around newspaper readership and civic engagement and political engagement. Remember, this is in the early 90s, mid 90s. So Argentina was a young democracy. There was a lot of concern about political engagement of the youth and teaching about the history and the political system and democratic values and so forth. So it was a program built around that. And it was a very interesting program. We did large-scale surveys of teachers and students, and it caught the attention of a professor at Stanford, Stephen Chafee. And Steve came to Argentina. He had similar programs in the US, in particular one called Kids Voting, which was about bringing kids to mock voting sites, and they would, quote unquote, vote. So similar idea of political or civic engagement in education at early age. The program caught his attention. He came to Argentina, he became involved, and at some point he offered me to apply to continue my studies in the US. And he was, of course, a professor and I believe even director of the Department of Communication at Stanford University at the time. And again, rather fortuitous encounter with Steve, to whom I own a great debt. Unfortunately, he passed at a fairly young age. But that was my journey to Stanford. Of course, I met you at that time while we were both graduate students, doctoral students. That was the beginning of the journey. I would say at the same time when I arrived at Stanford, I became fascinated not so much with old media, that is newspapers at the time, but that was the focus of my research. But suddenly everything was about the internet and online. So I quickly became fascinated with the new media and also questions of how this would impact inequality and development and countries in Latin America, for example. So I would say that's the journey that have taken me here is through, again, fortuitous program, old media, and then transitioning to new media, and articulating with my interest, larger interest in terms of social inequality issues.
That's fascinating. So you only applied to one program when you applied for graduate school in the US?
I'm embarrassed to say that, yes.
No, please. You have a success rate of 100% then.
It was one of those fortuitous meetings, and I didn't understand very well the world of U.S. academia, and in particular the media scholarship and which schools. I wanted to work with Stephen we wanted to continue working together on this program for newspapers in schools, as it was called, but also on kids voting and all these issues. And we did that. That was a great opportunity to continue working for a number of years with Steve on this program. So yes, Again, a fairly unique. I don't know. I never asked this question to others. How many schools you applied to? But my path was perhaps different than others.
That's fascinating. I mean, I would imagine that most people apply to more than one. Handful. Some apply to more than a handful, and it's a whole process. I mean, I remember I applied to several. That's why I was curious. So, for you, it was not coming to the US is part of a career that I planned, that I want to become a professor in the US, etc., etc. You had this research interest, and it's a way of continuing with that intellectual interest, even more than research.
Yeah, exactly. It really was. It really was, and I think it also speaks to something that I always tell students when they ask me where should I apply and which schools, and my answer is always that the primary concern has to be your fit, the fit between your interest and the research program at the department in general, but of specific faculty within that program. I think that's key. I would, advise against applying simply because students want to say that they got their degree from Stanford or from Harvard or from it's not about the name of the school as much as it is about the fit and the finding the common ground between one's personal research interest and program and those of the department and of the faculty of the program. Because a PhD is, I think it's not an individual journey, but it's really a journey of many people that are mentors and peers and it's not impossible, but I think it's difficult and it's challenging and probably is not as honestly rewarding to do a PhD where you just doing your thing on your own with some very loose mentoring and help in relation to others in your department. It has to be a collective enterprise, and this is what I always try to emphasize, that this is about not just your individual interests, but how they fit within a larger context of the program that you want to be part of.
Okay. I'm curious now. What are the other lessons learned from your experience, both first as a graduate student, but in particular over the past 20 years, mentoring students about do's and don'ts in that space?
Well, I think, and it's interesting because I'm thinking I've mentored here, mentor students in the United States, but I also mentor students in Argentina. And I think probably the answers are somewhat different because of the context and the resources that exist in American universities that are different that are resources that exist in Latin American universities. I think one of the things I try to emphasize is thinking long term and not rushing through the opportunity, and this is maybe particular for the US context, where you have the opportunity to really absorb a lot of knowledge and traditions and ideas and really be open-minded about, in your first maybe couple of years, about new ideas, new methodologies, new fields of study that maybe students haven't considered when they applied, but then they discover, as I discover new media and the internet when I got to Stanford, and in some way shifted my interest from civic engagement and newspapers to ended up writing a dissertation about digital television, but really more of a political economy of digital television and the transition from or a change in the way that governments were administering the radio spectrum. So it was not something that I ever thought I would do when I entered the PhD program. So I guess the point is, it's a great opportunity when you're accepted to a PhD program to really absorb, keep your mind open, explore outside, also explore outside the department, because universities are such, there's such a wealth of people and knowledge and ideas at the university that somehow when students are only looking within their department, I really encourage to go outside and talk to people in other schools and departments and other students. For example, I'm currently working with both faculty and students in research programs that involve education, the education school, the public policy school. We're trying to develop something with engineering, so very much interdisciplinary, which in Latin America is more challenging. I think in Latin America, it is not easy in the US, but in Latin America, I think for a number of reasons is in some ways more challenging. It depends on the context. Sometimes smaller, the fact that universities tend to be smaller makes it easier, but it is more challenging, particularly in the large public universities where even physically, if you study social sciences, you may be physically very, very far from those that study anything else. So even that provides the kind of siloing and separation that that I think one of the challenges for academia in Latin America is to really break down some of the silos that exist for decades.
Okay. Now going back to your own journey, then, how did you switch? The nuts and bolts. What made you pivot from newspaper reading, civic culture, etc., to the political economy of what was then the transition to digital media?
I think it was a combination of factors. Some of it, sometimes it's the cycle of a project. We wrapped up the project in a couple of years after I arrived at Stanford. The project in some way was wrapped up. There was some continuation with other projects that were US based, but I just wanted to explore other projects, and again, there was it was the time of the .com boom, and the internet was such a fascinating new thing coming up, and so many questions and issues of governance. There was such a green field for how our society is going to govern this this chaotic space. It was a lot more chaotic, the internet back in the days, in terms of users and applications and technologies, and fragmented in so many ways that I think the governance issues started to really fascinate me, and as well as I was fascinated by how this was, to some, the silver bullet to so many of the developing problems in Latin America and elsewhere. And I wanted to probe and question that as well. And also in the US, I think there were a lot of really promises and hopes around the internet that I wanted to probe and question, because the optimism around this being the technology that is going to improve education and improve health and address climate change, and really it was the one size fits all to every problem that societies had. Of course, this was part of the media discourse and even the political discourse at the time. But I became intrigued by that and wanted to question that, and wanted to probe into the inners of, okay, if this is going to happen, then let's see how it's going to happen, when and to whom, and whether it's going to really help address these problems and create more inequality or less inequality. So I just became very interested in all those issues at the time.
Okay, and so you shifted and you changed advisors as a result of that, right?
That's correct.
And so why USC? I mean, how was the transition from being a grad student to being a professor at USC?
That was at first a shock. I have to admit, the transition from being a student, a doctoral student, particularly because you have in your late stage all this freedom in time to write and think, and you know obviously you're working a lot because you're preparing your dissertation and you're anxious about the defense and you want to publish it, but you own your own time. You have a poverty level salary stipend, but you have that, and at the time it gives students a lot of freedom, academic and individual freedom. When you're a professor, obviously you have to teach classes, you have to go to meetings, you have to you suddenly became engaged in an institutional context, which one, and this is perhaps of your question about advice, maybe not to doctoral students, but to early career scholars, is be very careful about your engagement in your first years of becoming a professor, because it's very easy to get sucked up in duties that in the end will have very little payoff in terms of your academic productivity. And it's very easy, and some schools are not great at protecting that and preventing that from happening, and some of it is the temptation from new faculty to engage in so many other things as well. USC wasn't. USC's. I think we are very good, and we were very good at when I started, and we're still very good at that, at not doing that. But it was still a transition, and also. I think at the time USC was not as globally and internationally oriented, and it probably should be. Now it's different, but at the time, as my research shifted more and more to Latin America and global issues, it did feel isolating, being perhaps the only one in a department of probably 50 faculty that was fully looking at those issues as my primary area of research. So that changed quickly because we hired other faculty, and there were shifts in the faculty, but it is not easy to, and this perhaps is experience of some of either Latino or Latin American is in the field, is coming to a department where you're hired as the one person to study that, which is great because it's obviously it's great, but at the same time, it is difficult to come to a department and you're suddenly the only one, and there aren't a lot of colleagues that you can develop projects together and speak to and share ideas and bounce off new ideas. So for some time it felt isolated. It changed quickly. We a couple of years after I arrived at USC, we hired Manuel Castells. So talk about hire in terms of global media and internet. So we hired Manuel. Francois Barr came on board. There were many other shifts in the faculty that resulted in us coming together as a research group. But but I think I did feel the challenge, and I think it is a challenge for some of my colleagues in this field that are, again, either Latin Americanists or Latino scholars. If the department, even the department is fully supportive of them, but they have to find their intellectual community outside the department, maybe in other departments, maybe in other universities, and that definitely is a challenge.
So if I can follow up on that, what resources worked for you? I mean, if you had to share knowledge from your own experience, right? What would you advise the younger Hernan, right, who's starting now as opposed to just a few years ago when you started?
Well, I think I was fortunate to be able to connect with the resources fairly on in my career and fairly successful at grant writing. But it took me some time. I think, the earlier, this is another advice to grad students or doctoral students, the earlier you can engage in the art of grant writing and grant development, the better. Because sometimes doctoral students just become part of teams where they already have an NSF grant and the NSF grant is already there. You didn't have to do anything to get the grant. But the more the students can become engaged in understanding, okay, this is how I write a good grant proposal to a foundation, to the NSF, to the NIH, to whatever the funder is, it gives you an enormous advantage, because when you step into the role of, okay, now I have to produce those resources, you already understand the game a lot better. I had to understand, I had a pretty steep learning curve in terms of learning how to do that. It took me some time. I was lucky that eventually I learned the ropes and has been able to fundraise quite successfully, I think. But one advice I would have them would be, start earlier, even in your doctoral studies, and even just sit with your advisor and say, you're writing a grant. Let me help you and try to understand how this works, because in a few years' time, that student will be the one trying to get that grant. And again, it is great to learn those ropes early on. And I would say as the universities do provide training, but I think there probably have to be some training at department level, and more that we insist more to our grad students that, you should really go to that training to understand how to write a grant and how to, the difference between foundation funding and NSF funding. So, I've done a lot of development type funding from different development organizations. So all that, understanding the role of funding is important. For not just for us to do more social science, I think the humanities as well. Everybody really should be thinking more about funding and started early on that journey.
Okay, that's very good. So, following up on that, as you said, you have been extremely successful in general in the grant-getting arena, and in particular among development-oriented funding sources. In part because your work sort of has both a regional scope, right? It's comparative in the region, and you also have done important work, and particularly in the present time, doing very, very important work with underrepresented minorities, the Latino population in the US. So how would you compare how the field of communication and media studies, in your portion of the field, and in your sort of segment, sort of is looked at from a Latin American perspective versus from a US perspective?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. And again, having been in both a professor at American University and university in Argentina, in Latin America for almost a decade. The fields are very different. And you can probably say the same about political science and international relations and other fields. But I think ours is particularly different because of the very different traditions that I think most colleagues are aware of. The communication tradition in Latin America is a European, continental European tradition. And the tradition of media and communications in the US is a more, it's an American, more social science tradition. I think that difference was very clear 20 years ago when I started in the field. I work with Steve Chafee and other colleagues at Stanford, and I'll go back to Argentina. And when I talk to media scholars, it seemed like we were talking in different languages, truly different languages. We were talking past each other because of their training in semiotics and continental European philosophy, and my training in more social science type of media studies and so forth. That has changed a lot. I think for good, and I want to mention that I think your scholarship has been part of this, has been part of trying to blend some of this and the initiatives with Meso at San Andres. So the fields have come together, the traditions have come together quite a lot in the last 20 years. And I think it's good news because it still is a new, media and communication is still a new field. Some would say it's actually not a field, it's an issue area. So that discussion, I think it's still, I don't have particular interest in that discussion because sometimes it's sort of a semantic discussion of how you call things, but the reality is we are now more and more able to, or the differences between what communication is in Latin America and what communication is in the United States still exist, but have smoothed quite a bit and there's a lot more back and forth of scholars and students coming to study in the US or going to do their studies, stays in Latin America, and coming back to the US. So I think we've made a lot of great progress in bringing together two different traditions of scholarship, and the results are visible. I think we've got great publications and great scholarship and we read each other. It used to be that we just didn't read each other. I've been involved also in journals where we try to engage Latin American readership and also publish Latin American scholars. If I may plug an ad here, we just launched with CIDE in Mexico and the CETIS, the Centro de Estudios de Tecnología y Sociedad in San Andres in Argentina, launched a journal of I'm not saying the exact title, but it's basically the journal of la Revista Latinoamericana de Economía y Sociedad Digital. It is not the exact term, but is essentially trying to address the field of political economy and policy and social science studies about the internet in Spanish for not only for a Spanish audience, but where Spanish speaking scholars can publish in Spanish, and that actually has we are in our first issue, but again, it's another illustration of how these traditions have slowly but gradually come closer.
Okay, and if you could sort of engineer the way forward, what do you think are sort of the next important steps?
I think, having said that, let me put a big asterisk on that. In some ways, there's there's still ways to go. For example, conferences. I think American communication media conferences are still either too insular in terms of US issues, and there's 10 panels about, I go to policy conferences and there's 10 panels about Section 230. Well, Section 230 is interesting, but has no bearing on any other country because we don't have the First Amendment and we don't have Section 230. So, and oftentimes when we send papers, our sessions are called international. Well, that's not an issue. But literally, I get really upset when my session is called international, and suddenly your paper is about internet adoption and the gender digital divide and employment in Latin America, and the next paper is about spectrum auctions in Indonesia. So there's still work to be done in American academia to really open the doors for scholarships, scholarship of Latin America, Latin Americanists, Latino scholars as well. I think Latino scholars have made great progress, and Latinx studies and media studies. But there's still ways to go. There's still ways to go. I think, again, traditions have come close together, but institutionally, I think intellectually we've come closer together than institutionally, if I were to summarize it.
Okay, that's very interesting. So that would suggest that people are more ready than the organizations they work for.
Absolutely. It's a great different way to put, yes, this idea. Yes, absolutely. The organizations, perhaps naturally, organizations are difficult to change. You know this well. You've studied organizations all your life. They're difficult to change. There's traditions. There's unwritten rules, and there's written rules as well. And there's issues of resources. Issues of sometimes even the nitty-gritty of visas and all this that obviously the last years have not been helpful in that sense. So all these institutional barriers still matter. And again, I think the intellectually we've come closer, organizationally and institutionally we still have a lot of work to do.
Very interesting. So if you have magical powers then and could be granted one wish about how you'd like to change the field of communication and media studies, or how you'd like the field of communication and media studies to change, what would you wish for?
Well, perhaps along the lines of what we just talked about is that we could bring more, create a truly global field. I think in US academia, we have a US, in media and communication, we have a US field with sprinkles of Europe and sprinkles of Asia, but really is South Korea and China and Hong Kong, perhaps. That's our field in terms of how global our field is. If I had magical powers, I would really try to hope that the field comes together as a truly global field of scholarships, and we are reading African scholarship and Latin American scholarship as much as we're reading European and American scholarships, and vice versa.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Hernan, for the fascinating conversation. Thank you very much, all of you in the audience, for listening to this episode, staying with us to the end. And I invite you to tune in to the next episode of El Café Latinx. Goodbye. El Café Latinx is a production of the Center for Latinx Digital Media in the Department of Communication Studies at Northwestern University. I am Pablo Boczkowski, your host, and I'm joined by executive producer Mora Matasi.